There are levels of understanding, layers of truth. Truth within truth within truth within truth. When attempting to contemplate the social economic of the geopolitic that we who read the book recognize to be the rising of the one world Antichrist beast system. I try to cover each of those layers, each of those levels of truth, and we'll be attempting to go into the deeper layers, the higher levels in future uploads, including the ultimate, which is the spiritual level. We could understand those layers as money, power, intelligence, philosophy, and then the spiritual realm. But this upload will be primarily focused with the lower levels of the situation, things which are still vital to understand in correct context of what's playing out on the world stage. Because it's been my experience that one layer or level leads to the next. So if you don't have your lower level situated and you don't have your spiritual sight correct, the top and the bottom, then everything in between is likely to be off. And I say that, of course, with the understanding that I'm not trying to tell anyone how it is, just what I believe to be, and offer some perspectives that I think are worthwhile to contemplate and that aren't readily available here in the West. Certainly not through the mainstream channels. So without further ado, here is some analysis. For me, this woman's been putting out some of the best, you could call it lower level analysis of the pandemic and now this Ukrainian situation over the past couple years.
For many years, people from policy experts to world leaders have been warning that the West's NATO expansion towards Ukraine would result in exactly what's happening now, Russia resorting to force to keep Ukraine out of NATO. Here's Mikhail Gorbachev in April of 1997 speaking to members of Congress, warning them about the planned expansion of NATO.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
Ну и другое, это что уже, новая стратегия?
So my question is this a new strategy?
Говорят, нет.
It was Gorbachev who Bush Sr. made the assurances to that NATO wouldn't expand. So when he talks about being humiliated, it's likely also personal. But just stop for a moment and think. This was 1997, 25 years ago. We've been aggressively expanding NATO for over 2 decades before Russia ultimately snapped. Another warning came in 2010. Here's Russian historian and NYU professor Stephen F. Cohen speaking at Carnegie Mellon.
NATO expansion is not over for the Russians. It's a reality. NATO's sitting on its borders. It's not about future NATO expansion, it's about current. NATO expansion represents the following to Russia. And near this I will end. It represents a profoundly broken promise to Russia made by the first Bush that in return for united Germany and NATO would not expand eastward. This is beyond any dispute. People say, well, they never signed a treaty. But a deal is a deal. The United States gives its word unless we're shysters. And if you don't get it in writing, we'll cheat you. We broke our word. And when both Putin and Medvedev say publicly to Madeleine Albright and others, we, Russia, feel deceived and betrayed, that's what they're talking about. So NATO represents, on the part of Russia, a lack of trust. You break your words to us. To what extent can we trust you? Secondly, it represents military encirclement. If you sit in the Kremlin and you look out at where NATO is and where they want to go, it's everywhere. It's everywhere on Russia's borders.
So he makes a great point about honoring our word, even if it isn't in writing, unless we're a bunch of shysters, he says. And maybe we are. In 2015, international relations expert John Mersheimer talked about how we're purposefully baiting Ukraine to take a hard line with Russia under false promises of inviting them into the West.
But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. Well, as I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis.
Ultimately, Ukraine gets wrecked, he says. And that was in 2015, and we're watching this now in real time. The Ukrainians and Russians sat down at peace talks, and rather than agree to become neutral, which is Russia's demand, Ukraine is taking a hard line, and we're witnessing their country get destroyed as a result. And now it's likely the country will be split in 2 or possibly 3 the further Ukraine goes into the conflict, unwilling to negotiate. Yesterday in Biden's State of the Union address, he said, quote, "The NATO alliance was created to secure peace and stability in Europe after World War II. But I got to admit, it's not feeling like it. Biden also said Putin had rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy, but many of us are wondering what those diplomacy attempts were. Russia has been clear for nearly 3 decades now. No NATO on their borders. They've said it over and over and over again, and yet we've continued to expand. We've expanded NATO and invaded and occupied various areas of the Middle East. Europe has created a union of member nations, and yet all the while we've been accusing Russia of wanting to reestablish the USSR. We've even put missiles up to their border in our NATO member states as a response. And now we're all in danger, not just Ukrainians, of an all-out nuclear war because our leaders continue to refuse to back down. The irony is, when Russia annexed Crimea and when Assad was accused of gassing his own people, American neocons were upset Obama had set a red line, but refused to actually do anything about it when it was crossed. Those same neocons are shocked Putin actually said arming Ukraine is a red line and meant it. He wasn't bluffing, and he's not going to back down. The Russians have told us this would happen for decades now. I see many people saying it shouldn't be up to us or Russia if Ukraine joins NATO, that each country should be allowed to decide for themselves. But it doesn't work like that. NATO isn't a right. It's a club. It's an agreement that if one nation is invaded, the others will come to their collective defense. We should be allowed to choose who we want to rush to the defense of and who we think will be valuable in our defense when needed. The point of NATO is safety in numbers. But if adding a member makes the entire group unsafe, it defeats the point. But honestly, this entire situation with Ukraine and the U.S.'s unwillingness to militarily defend Ukraine because we don't want a nuclear war with Russia, which I agree with, calls into question the entire point to NATO. NATO was formed specifically to go to war with the Soviets. But if we're unwilling to go to war with them because it's a complete danger, then what is the actual purpose of NATO? But ultimately, my point is, the dog barked and barked and growled and growled. People even pointed year after year that the dog is growling and dangerous, yet we kept taunting the dog, and now the dog is attacking. And we're sitting here acting shocked, claiming that there was no provocation on our end.
They say there are 2 sides to every story. Consider both before you form an opinion. Easier said than done. Look at the conflict in Ukraine. One side is dominating the global narrative. The other side has been proclaimed the villain. I'm talking about NATO and Russia. And while there's a solid case against Russia here, this story too has another side. And as the tellers of the story, we must dwell on and reflect it. Vladimir Putin's aggression is being called out, and rightly so. Invading a sovereign country cannot be justified. But what led the world to the point of this invasion? Leaders in Moscow say they are the aggrieved party, they are the victims of NATO's eastward march, and they're only acting in self-defense. Here's why. Over the past 25 years, NATO has been creeping closer to the Russian border. Former Soviet states have become NATO members. This military alliance has technically absorbed the entire security belt of Moscow. Russia sees this expansion as a provocation. It hurts their security interests and won't end well for both sides, they said. The warnings were clear. NATO ignored them. Call it their myopia or arrogance. They downplayed Moscow's concerns, kept proceeding with new rounds of expansion until things blew up in Ukraine. Did NATO push Ukraine into this war? Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. I'm 𝙀𝙬𝙋𝘼𝙉𝙑𝙊𝙑, and today I want to discuss why NATO cannot escape the blame for what's unfolding in Ukraine. First things first, what is NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a security alliance between North America and Europe. It was formed after the Second World War. The goal, they say, was to protect democratic freedom. On the 4th of April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. This treaty was simply an anti-Soviet accord aimed at countering any future aggression by the USSR. It established a new balance of power in Europe. It promised all members collective security. That's a core principle laid out in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. It obliges member states to protect each other in case of a war. It says an armed attack against one ally will be an attack on all allies. Meaning, if one NATO nation is attacked, all NATO nations will retaliate. This allowed NATO members to pool and share their military resources. They built efficient defense capabilities, but there was more to NATO than just defense. It was an alliance of liberal countries, an engine of democratization that was supposed to promote common values and interests, also push back against the rise of communism. Naturally, Moscow saw this alliance as a threat to its interests. In response, it created the Warsaw Pact in the year 1955. It was a counterweight to NATO, the Warsaw Pact. These were the members. Their goal was the same. If one Warsaw Pact member is attacked, all others will defend it. In Russian historical memory, there were 5 reasons why such a pact was justified, 5 major invasions when the West threatened Russian interests. This includes the Polish occupation of the Kremlin in early 17th century, the Swedish invasion of Russia in early 18th century, the Napoleon invasion of the 19th century, and the 2 wars with Germany in the 20th century. In each case, the very essence of the Russian state was threatened. So suspicion and fear of the West took deep roots in Russia. Moscow began perceiving NATO as a tool of American imperialism. And the assessment was not really off the mark. In 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated and the Iron Curtain was completely demolished. Europe's regional order hinged on one question: should Germany align itself with the US and NATO, or should it join the Russians through the Warsaw Pact? The US government, under George H.W. Bush, made an offer to Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev. It suggested if Germany became a NATO member, NATO would stop expanding, not 1 inch eastwards. No new members. Today, the US says it made no such promise, that no such deal was ever struck, but hundreds of memos, meeting minutes, and transcripts from US archives indicate otherwise. Nevertheless, Moscow bought the offer. It demolished the Warsaw Pact in the hope that the West would follow suit, that NATO too would be dissolved. But that never happened. NATO refused to cease operations. And to add insult to injury, they kept the door for membership open. Russia saw it as a stab in the back, and NATO kept pushing the dagger deeper. Look at this map. NATO started out with 12 founding members, but since the Soviet Union fell, it has radically expanded eastwards. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, there was another wave of expansion. 7 Central and Eastern European nations were made NATO members. Some of them were former Soviet republics. In 2009, Albania and Croatia joined NATO. And the most recent entries were Montenegro and North Macedonia, both situated in Russia's backyard. It does not end there. As of 2021, NATO officially recognized 3 more aspiring members: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. Last we checked, NATO was also in talks with Sweden, Finland, and Serbia for membership. So to put it simply, much of Eastern Europe, which once used to be part of the Soviet Union, has now joined NATO, and this happened despite Russia's protests and warnings. The last reasonably friendly warning from Moscow came in the year 2007. Vladimir Putin addressed the annual Munich conference. where he said, and I'm quoting, "NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders. This expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask against whom is this expansion intended and what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact." These sentiments have been echoed by a host of American strategists. I'll give you a few examples. June 1997, 50 prominent foreign policy experts signed an open letter to President Bill Clinton calling America's efforts to expand NATO a policy error of historic proportions. Then we have George Kennan, the father of America's containment policy during the Cold War. He too called NATO expansion a tragic mistake with no reason whatsoever. The warnings went on for decades. In 2008, William J. Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, wrote a letter to the State Department where he said that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. He said that even Putin's sharpest critics at home consider Ukraine's entry a direct challenge to Russian interests. It does not end there. This is Robert M. Gates. He was the defense secretary in the Bush and Obama administrations. He wrote in his memoir that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. Then we have Strobe Talbot, a former Deputy Secretary of State. He described the Russian perception in a similar way, how they consider NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, and point out that if the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, why did the West not dismantle NATO? So several voices in the Western world had warned that Russia's protests have merit and that NATO expansion could spell serious trouble. Yet, successive American administrations paid no heed to these warnings. They kept widening NATO's security umbrella. Inviting a state right on Russia's border into an anti-Russian alliance is provocation.